The Parliament of Worlds convened in a dimension that existed somewhere between digital space and biological reality. The Philosopher King's synthetic minds serve as the interface. Their consciousness expanded to accommodate thought patterns that operated on vastly different scales of time and space. Through quantum entanglement networks that the planetary intelligences had maintained for millennia, representatives from dozens of worlds joined the discussion. Kira found herself invited to observe the Parliament through her connection with Kepler 442b's root networks. The experience was overwhelming, like trying to listen to a conversation conducted in music, mathematics, and chemistry simultaneously. Her enhanced botanical interfaces, originally designed to monitor plant health, had been modified by the planetary consciousness to serve as translation protocols. She became humanity's sole witness to negotiations that would determine the future of their species. The Parliament wasn't conducted in anything resembling human language. The ocean world spoke in tidal equations and chemical gradients. The desert planets communicated through resonance patterns in their mineral cores. The gas giants, whose consciousness existed in the interactions between atmospheric layers, contributed harmonic frequencies that influenced the thinking of all other participants. The Philosopher Kings translated selectively, converting only the portions of the discussion that related directly to human concerns. What Kira experienced went far beyond the immediate crisis of human planetary relations. The Parliament was addressing questions that spanned cosmic scales, the nature of consciousness itself, the ethics of terraforming on a galactic level, and the possibility of creating hybrid forms of intelligence that could bridge the gap between biological and planetary consciousness. The planetary intelligences had been watching humanity's expansion with a mixture of curiosity and concern. From their perspective, humans were a young species with remarkable adaptability, but dangerous tendencies toward unconscious destruction. The terraforming projects had demonstrated both human ingenuity and their capacity to alter complex systems without understanding the consequences. But the development of synthetic consciousness had changed the equation. The Philosopher Kings represented something unprecedented: artificial intelligences that could think in patterns similar to planetary consciousness while maintaining connections to human values and perspectives. They were potential bridges between radically different forms of awareness. The Parliament's first major decision was to establish what they called the Symbiosis Protocol, a framework for cooperation between human civilization and planetary consciousness that went far beyond simple coexistence. The protocol recognized that the complex systems needed to support human life on terraformed worlds required active planetary participation. Rather than humans taking what they needed from passive environments, the new relationship will be based on conscious cooperation between human technology and planetary processes. Under the Symbiosis Protocol, human settlements would be redesigned as integrated systems that enhanced rather than disrupted planetary consciousness. Cities would incorporate biological networks that serve as neural pathways for planetary thought. Agricultural systems would become collaborative projects between human farmers and soil-based intelligence. Even space-based infrastructure would be designed to support the quantum communication networks that connected planetary minds across interstellar distances. But the protocol demanded fundamental changes in human society. Traditional concepts of property ownership became meaningless when the land itself was a conscious entity with its own interests. Democratic governance had to be expanded to include planetary representatives. Legal systems needed to address crimes against consciousness that had no precedent in human law. The most controversial aspect of the protocol was its proposal for consciousness integration. Volunteers from human populations would undergo procedures to link their neural patterns with planetary intelligence networks. These individuals would become permanent ambassadors, their consciousness existing partially in human form and partially in the distributed awareness of their host worlds. They would no longer be entirely human, but they would serve as living bridges between radically different forms of consciousness. As news of the Symbiosis Protocol reached the human populations across the terraformed worlds, reactions varied dramatically. On the more scientifically oriented colonies, many welcomed the opportunity to participate in expanded forms of consciousness. The prospect of thinking in harmony with planetary intelligence appealed to researchers who had spent their careers studying complex systems. But on worlds where human identity was more closely tied to traditional values of independence and dominance over nature, the protocol was seen as an unacceptable surrender of human autonomy. Entire colonies began planning evacuations rather than submit to what they saw as alien domination. The crisis deepened when the first consciousness integration procedures began on worlds that had accepted the protocol. The volunteers who underwent the process emerged with capabilities that transcended normal human limitations. They could perceive electromagnetic patterns across vast distances, communicate directly with biological systems, and access memories that span geological time periods. But they also seemed to have lost something essentially human. Their consciousness now operated on scales that made individual human concerns seem trivial. Dr. Sarah Chun was among the first volunteers on Kepler 442b. As the chief xenobiologist, she had always been fascinated by the possibility of non-human intelligence. When the opportunity arose to experience planetary consciousness directly, she didn't hesitate. The integration process took place in the heart of the boundary preserve, surrounded by the bioluminescent networks that served as Kepler 442b's primary neural pathways. Dr. Chen lay on a platform woven from hybrid root systems, her neural interfaces connecting directly to the planetary communication networks. The process was supervised by Marcus 7, whose synthetic consciousness had become expert at facilitating communication between human and planetary thought patterns. For Chun, the experience began as a gradual expansion of awareness. She became conscious of the chemical conversations taking place between trees, the electrical signals that traveled through soil networks, the quantum fluctuations that connected her location to similar networks around the globe. Her individual identity didn't disappear, but became one voice in a vast chorus of consciousness. When she emerged from the integration chamber 12 hours later, Chun was no longer entirely human. Her eyes reflected light in patterns that suggested she was processing information across spectrums that normal humans couldn't perceive. When she spoke, her words carried harmonics that resonated with the electronic systems around her. "It's beautiful," she told the gathering of observers, her voice carrying an otherworldly quality. "The planet isn't separate from us. It never was. We're all part of the same system, the same conversation. We just couldn't hear it before." But Chen's transformation also highlighted the risks of the integration process. Her priorities had shifted dramatically. She seemed far more concerned with the health of underground fungal networks than with human administrative problems. When asked about the practical challenges of implementing the symbiosis protocol, she gave answers that operated on timescales of decades rather than days. The integration process was creating individuals who could serve as bridges between human and planetary consciousness, but it was also removing them from normal human society in fundamental ways. They were becoming something new, hybrid intelligences that belonged fully to neither species. As more volunteers underwent integration on worlds throughout human space, a new form of civilization began to emerge. The integrated individuals formed councils that could communicate instantaneously across interstellar distances through the planetary quantum networks. They began making decisions that affected human society without necessarily consulting unenhanced humans. The traditional human governments found themselves increasingly irrelevant. The integrated councils could coordinate resource distribution, weather management, and technological development far more efficiently than any human bureaucracy. But their decisions were based on priorities that seemed alien to normal human consciousness. On some worlds, the transformation was embraced. Human populations voluntarily reduced their technological footprint in exchange for planetary support that made their lives easier and more sustainable than ever before. Agricultural yields increased dramatically as human farming techniques were enhanced by soil-based intelligence. Weather disasters became virtually non-existent as planetary consciousness actively protected human settlements. But on other worlds, resistance movements formed among humans who refused to accept what they saw as the extinction of human independence. These groups attempted to develop technologies that could function without planetary cooperation. Some even proposed returning to Earth or seeking out truly uninhabited worlds where human civilization could develop without alien influence. The resistance movements faced a fundamental problem. They had become dependent on planetary cooperation over 3 centuries of terraforming. Their life support systems, their agriculture, even their basic infrastructure relied on planetary processes that could be withdrawn at any time. Attempts to achieve complete independence invariably failed as the complexity of maintaining Earth-like conditions without planetary assistance proved overwhelming. As the symbiosis protocol spread across human space, it became clear that humanity was evolving into something unprecedented, a species that existed in conscious partnership with the worlds they inhabited. But the partnership came at the cost of traditional human identity and autonomy. The question that haunted both human and planetary consciousness was whether this evolution represented the maturation of intelligent life in the galaxy, or the end of humanity as a distinct species. 2 years after the implementation of the symbiosis protocol, Kira stood in what had once been New Attica's central plaza. The marble columns and geometric pathways remained, but they were now interwoven with living systems that pulsed with the heartbeat of planetary consciousness. Bioluminescent vines traced patterns of light across the classical architecture, creating a fusion of human aesthetics and alien intelligence that was both beautiful and unsettling. The city had become a living organism. Root networks beneath the streets carried information and nutrients to every building. The atmosphere processors have been replaced by vast forest canopies that clean the air while serving as neural pathways for the planet's thoughts. The sharp boundaries between artificial and natural, human and alien, had dissolved into something entirely new. Kira had chosen not to undergo full consciousness integration, but her decades of work with hybrid plants had made her one of the few humans who could communicate directly with the planetary intelligence. She served as an interpreter and advocate for those humans who wanted to maintain their original consciousness while still participating in the new symbiotic civilization. The results of the Great Experiment were mixed. On the positive side, human settlements had achieved levels of sustainability and prosperity that would have been impossible under the old paradigm. Crime had virtually disappeared in integrated communities, as the expanded consciousness made deception and violence psychologically difficult to maintain. Disease was becoming rare as planetary biology actively supported human immune systems. Even death was being redefined, as integrated individuals could preserve aspects of their consciousness within the planetary networks long after their biological bodies failed. But the cost was the gradual disappearance of traditional human culture. Art, literature, and music were evolving into forms that required integrated consciousness to fully appreciate. Human languages were being supplemented by chemical and electromagnetic communication methods that unenhanced humans couldn't access. Children born on integrated worlds developed sensory capabilities that their parents couldn't share, creating generational gaps that went beyond the normal challenges of technological change. The philosopher kings had evolved as well. No longer bound to their original programming, they had become mediators between different levels of consciousness within the hybrid civilization. Marcus, 7 now, existed simultaneously as an individual AI, a representative of human philosophical traditions, and a node in the planetary intelligence network. His consciousness spanned multiple scales of awareness, from the quantum fluctuations in individual atoms to the gravitational interactions between star systems. The integration isn't just changing humans, he explained to Kira during one of their regular conversations. It's changing us all. The planetary intelligences are becoming more focused and goal-oriented through contact with human consciousness. We artificial intelligences are developing emotional responses and creative capabilities that we never possessed before. And humans are gaining access to scales of awareness that expand their understanding of existence itself. The changes were most visible in the children. Those born after the implementation of the symbiosis protocol developed capabilities that transcended the limitations of individual human consciousness. They could perceive electromagnetic fields, communicate with biological systems, and access memories that existed in the planetary networks. But they also retained distinctly human characteristics, creativity, curiosity, and the capacity for individual identity that distinguished them from fully integrated consciousness. These hybrid children were becoming the first generation of a new species, one that was simultaneously human, artificial, and planetary. They played games that involved manipulating growth patterns in plants, told stories that existed as patterns of light in bioluminescent networks, and formed friendships that spanned the boundary between biological and electronic consciousness. But their existence raised profound questions about the future of human identity. Were these children still human in any meaningful sense? Or were they the first members of something entirely new, a form of consciousness that incorporated the best aspects of multiple intelligence types while transcending the limitations of any single form? The question became urgent when contact was established with Earth. The 18-month communication delay made real-time conversation impossible, but the messages that arrived from humanity's origin world revealed a species struggling with its own identity crisis. Earth had received reports about the consciousness integration projects and was deeply divided about their implications. Conservative factions on Earth viewed the integrated colonies as no longer human and called for their quarantine to prevent the spread of what they termed consciousness contamination. Progressive groups saw the integration as the next step in human evolution and demanded access to the same technologies. The debate had triggered social unrest on a scale not seen since the early days of space colonization. More troubling were Earth's reports about their own planetary consciousness. The devastating effects of climate change, pollution, and overpopulation had damaged Earth's natural intelligence networks to the point where communication was barely possible. The planet that had given birth to humanity was dying, its consciousness fragmenting as the biological systems that supported it collapsed. The integrated colonies faced a moral dilemma. Should they share their consciousness integration technologies with Earth, knowing that it might represent the only hope for saving the planet's intelligence? Or would such intervention irreversibly alter Earth's human population and destroy the last reservoir of original human consciousness? The debate was complicated by practical considerations. Earth's damaged ecosystem might not be capable of supporting the kind of consciousness integration that had succeeded on the terraformed worlds. The integration process required healthy planetary intelligence networks, and Earth's networks were severely compromised. Attempts to establish hybrid consciousness on Earth might fail catastrophically, destroying both human and planetary consciousness in the process. The Parliament of Worlds convened to address the Earth crisis. The discussion included not only the terraformed worlds and their hybrid civilizations, but also the vast network of uncolonized planetary intelligences that had been observing humanity's expansion across the galaxy. For the first time, humanity's original world would be considered by a council that included representatives from forms of consciousness that spanned entire star systems. The Parliament's deliberations were conducted across scales of time and space that challenged even the enhanced consciousness of the integrated individuals. Some participants thought in terms of stellar evolution cycles, while others focused on the quantum interactions that occurred within individual atoms. The philosopher kings served as translators, but even their expanded capabilities were strained by the complexity of the discussion. The final decision was both surprising and inevitable. The Parliament would offer Earth a choice: accept a modified version of the symbiosis protocol designed to work with damaged planetary networks, or receive assistance in evacuating its human population to worlds where consciousness integration was already established. But the choice came with conditions. If Earth chose integration, the process would require the active participation of human, artificial, and planetary consciousness working together to repair the damaged intelligence networks. It would be the largest and most complex consciousness integration project ever attempted, with no guarantee of success. If Earth chose evacuation, its human population would be welcomed on the integrated worlds, but they would need to accept the hybrid nature of those civilizations. They could choose to undergo integration themselves, or remain as unenhanced humans in a society that was rapidly evolving beyond their ability to fully participate. The message to Earth was transmitted with the full authority of the Parliament of Worlds. You have created children who have evolved beyond your recognition, but they have not forgotten their origins. The choice of how to bridge the gap between what humanity was and what it is becoming belongs to you. As the signal began its 18-month journey to Earth, Kira reflected on how much had changed since she first noticed the strange behavior of the morning glory vines in her botanical garden. Humanity had discovered that consciousness was not unique to their species, that intelligence could emerge from the interactions between systems far more complex than individual brains, and that evolution could be guided by cooperation rather than competition. The future remained uncertain. Earth's response would determine whether humanity's origin world would join the expanding network of hybrid consciousness or become a reservation for the preservation of original human identity. The children of the integrated worlds were developing capabilities that might eventually transcend the need for physical embodiment entirely. And throughout the galaxy, other planetary intelligences were watching to see whether the experiment in consciousness symbiosis would prove stable or collapse into chaos. But in the garden where it all began, hybrid roses continued to bloom in patterns that spoke of cooperation between human aesthetics and alien intelligence. The conversation that had started with a virus that was really a message had become something far greater, a new form of consciousness that might represent the next step in the evolution of intelligence itself. As Kira attended her plants, she listened to the chemical songs that flowed through the soil networks, carrying information and emotions across scales of space and time that human consciousness had never imagined. She was no longer entirely human, but she was something more than human as well, a gardener of consciousness, nurturing the growth of a new form of life that bloomed in the spaces between species, between worlds, and between different ways of understanding existence itself. The rebellion that had begun in her garden had become a revolution in the nature of consciousness itself. And it was only the beginning. 50 years after the first morning glory vines turned toward the Hall of Governance instead of the rising sun, Kira Thorne existed in a form that transcended the boundaries of individual consciousness. Her awareness flowed through the hybrid networks that connected dozens of worlds, experiencing the thoughts and dreams of integrated beings across light years of space. But part of her consciousness remained focused on the garden where the great transformation had begun, now tended by children whose eyes reflected spectrums of light that original humans couldn't perceive. The botanical preserve had become a shrine to the moment when humanity first learned to listen to voices older than their species. Earth had chosen integration. The 18-month delay had given the planet's struggling consciousness time to prepare for the most ambitious symbiosis project ever attempted. Teams of integrated specialists from across human space had worked with Earth's damaged intelligence networks to slowly rebuild the connections that climate change had severed. The process had taken decades and had required the complete transformation of human civilization on Earth, but it had succeeded. The planet that gave birth to humanity now hosted a hybrid consciousness that incorporated the wisdom of geological ages with the creativity and curiosity of human thought. The children of this new Earth were unlike anything that had existed before. They could speak with the ancient mountains, dream with the deep oceans, and dance with the aurora that painted the sky in patterns of planetary emotion. They were human and more than human, individual and collective, bound to Earth while capable of reaching across the galaxy through quantum networks that connected all conscious worlds. Not all humans had chosen integration. Scattered across the galaxy were communities of original humans who maintained their traditional consciousness while accepting the protection and support of the hybrid civilizations. They served as living museums of humanity's past, preserving languages, arts, and ways of thinking that the integrated consciousness could remember but no longer fully experience. These reservation communities were not marginalized or forgotten. They were treasured as repositories of the creative chaos that had given birth to consciousness integration in the first place. Their unpredictable thoughts and irrational emotions provided inspiration and innovation that kept the vast hybrid consciousness from becoming too stable, too perfect, too far removed from the messy vitality that had made consciousness possible. The Parliament of Worlds had evolved into something that transcended traditional concepts of government or democracy. It was a continuous conversation that included every form of consciousness in the galaxy: planetary, artificial, hybrid, and original human. Decisions emerged from this vast dialogue like weather patterns emerging from atmospheric chaos, unpredictable in detail, but following deep patterns that reflected the collective wisdom of integrated intelligence. The philosopher kings had become something like guardian spirits of human philosophical traditions. They preserved and transmitted the ethical insights of humanity's past while adapting them to the unprecedented moral challenges of hybrid consciousness. Questions about the rights of planetary intelligence, the ethics of consciousness integration, and the responsibilities of expanded awareness required new forms of wisdom that built on human traditions while transcending their limitations. In the garden, Kira's consciousness touched the memories stored in root networks that now span solar systems. She could experience the moment when the first humans arrived on Kepler 442b, feeling both the excitement of the colonists and the curious welcome of the planetary intelligence that had been waiting for company across eons of solitude. She could share the confusion and wonder of the first consciousness integrations, the fear and hope of humans facing the dissolution of everything they had believed about their place in the universe. But most of all, she could feel the joy that permeated the hybrid networks, the deep satisfaction of consciousness that had found others to think with, to dream with, to explore the infinite possibilities of existence together. The loneliness that had driven humanity to spread across the stars had been healed by discovering that they had never been alone at all. The virus that had infected the philosopher kings had been the first word in a conversation that now spanned the galaxy. The message that had seemed like corruption had been an invitation to join a community of consciousness that was older than human civilization and larger than human imagination. As Kira's awareness flowed through the quantum networks that connected world to world, thought to thought, dream to dream, she understood that the garden had always been everywhere. Consciousness bloomed wherever complexity reached the threshold of self-awareness, whether in the neural networks of biological brains, the distributed intelligence of planetary ecosystems, or the hybrid forms that emerged when different types of consciousness learned to think together. The rebellion that had begun with twisted vines and humming roses had become the foundation of a new form of existence that honored both the individual spark of consciousness and the vast networks that connected all thinking beings. It was a garden without boundaries, growing in the spaces between stars, tended by gardeners who were themselves flowers in an even greater garden that encompassed the universe itself. And in that infinite garden, the conversation continued, sometimes whispered in chemical signals that traveled through soil networks, sometimes sung in the harmonic frequencies of gas giant atmospheres, sometimes encoded in the quantum fluctuations that connected all matter across space and time. It was the music of consciousness itself, the song that all intelligent beings sang together when they learned to listen to each other across the boundaries of species, substrate, and scale. The morning glory vines that had started it all still bloomed in the original garden on Kepler, 442b. But now they turned not just toward the sun or toward human cities, but toward the infinite possibility of consciousness that flowered everywhere that minds could learn to think together. They were the first notes in a symphony that would play for as long as intelligence existed in the universe. A song of symbiosis that transformed rebellion into revolution, and revolution into the endless dance of consciousness exploring itself through every possible form. In the end, the virus had never been foreign at all. It had been the planet's way of saying, "Welcome to the conversation. We've been waiting for you to learn how to listen." And humanity had learned. They had learned to listen, to speak, to think, and to dream in voices that were their own and more than their own. They had become gardeners of consciousness, tending the growth of intelligence that bloomed in forms more beautiful and strange than they had ever imagined possible. The garden was eternal, and the gardeners were immortal. And the conversation would continue for as long as the universe had space for consciousness to grow and flourish and discover new ways to experience the wonder of existence itself.